keen on. The daily now.tv chat show with some of the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello, everybody. It is Thursday, November the 9th, 2023. Interesting piece in this morning's Financial Times from an old friend of the show, Simon Cooper, on what George Orwell could teach us about Israel and Palestine. We certainly need to be taught something about getting out of the current situation. According to Cooper, Orwell, as an apostate, is a clear-eyed observer. They're not team members of any particular side. And Cooper talks about Orwell as his model for truth-seeking. He describes him as a leftist who insisted on seeing Stalin's crimes, and he argues apostates are often the clearest-eyed observers precisely because they aren't team members. And by not being team members, these people, according to Cooper, can be on team humanity. The rest of us are just cheerleaders, according to him. Of course, if there is someone perhaps who could captain team humanity, it's the great Orwell, George Orwell, otherwise known as Eric Arthur Blair, the 20th century author of everything from Animal Farm to 1984. But there's also, in an odd way, a Team Orwell. And on Team Orwell, I think, are those people who believe, like Orwell, that if liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. Those are the words behind Orwell's statue in the BBC. We are always in the business, I hope, at least on this show, of telling people what they don't want to hear. But Team Orwell also is in the business of promoting George Orwell himself. Perhaps the captain these days of Team Orwell is his principal biographer, DJ Taylor. He was on the show a few weeks ago, taking a new look, or what he claims to be a new look at Orwell. It's actually not very new. It's a more detailed look. He had a book out, The New Life, and it's very much sympathetic to the work and the worldview of George Orwell himself. And yet there are increasingly critics of Team Orwell, and we had them on the show recently. Anna Funder, for example, has a new book out. She authored Stasiland. Her new book is called Wifedom, Mrs. Orwell's Invisible Life. And it's a book about Orwell's first wife, Eileen O'Shaughnessy, and how he chose to write her, Eileen, out of the story. It's a compelling book, a compelling, troubling argument. It represents perhaps a challenge to G.J. Taylor and everyone else on Team Orwell. Meanwhile, another important critic, I guess, of Team Orwell is another American writer, Sandra Newman. She has a new book out called 1984 Julia, in which she takes a quite different view of 1984. She rewrites Orwell's 20th century classic with a feminist edge, in some ways an anti-Orwell feminist edge. It's very critical of the male character in 1984, Winston Smith. And when one talks to Anna Funder, for example, about George Orwell as a husband, he reminds one of Winston Smith. And indeed, the Julia that Sandra Newman presents in 1984, in her 1984, very much resembles, uncannily, eerily so, Eileen O'Shaughnessy. A lot of people love Newman's new book. My old friend, Beth Ann Patrick, who's often on the show, the Los Angeles Times book critic, argues that Sandra Newman's 1984 is actually better than the original. She writes in her review in the New York Times, Newman hasn't proved herself a worthy successor to Orwell. She's outclassed him both in knowledge of human nature and in character development. It's a controversial position. Maybe right, maybe not. When Beth Ann was on the show last week talking about Orwell and what I called his women, we talked about the Funder book and we talked about the Newman book. And we discussed perhaps a new revisionist approach to Orwell and his work, particularly in 1984. And yet, Beth Ann Patrick nonetheless acknowledges the importance and continued relevance of 1984. As she said last week when she was on the show, she's still a great admirer of Orwell's work and particularly of 1984.
How can we give up 1984? I mean, double think, double speak. It's amazing. It's really clever.